Hello, hello, hello. It's finally time. We're here. Steel Ball Run, Jojo's Bizarre Adventure, Part 7, the most highly rated and beloved part of the series, and I've finally gotten around to reading it, which is excellent news. Um, it took a little while, but I'm not too concerned about this time. Pretty simply because this is the longest part so far by quite a way. Um, though it doesn't seem it from the chapter count. It does make up for it by having really quite long chapters because I was moved from shonen to seinen, which I wasn't even aware of until I had finished. But it does make sense. Um, and in terms of my overall thoughts on it, and did I like it? I can definitely say that it was the best part so far, and it's probably like a 8 teetering on a 9 out of 10. Um, However, I was almost maybe expecting more from something that's this highly acclaimed, and that might be silly of me to say, but it probably has negatively impacted my view, particularly for the first half of this, which really felt not much different from parts 4 through 6. But we'll get into that as we get through this. And as you can see, probably, I completely forgot to mention, there's now a lovely PowerPoint instead of me just scrolling through my notes. I do have my notes. I've written way more than normal. I've got them on my laptop to the side here. But I decided to make a PowerPoint because I just think, if you're watching a video, it's not going to be very interesting just to see some words, the same words I mean, this video could go over an hour. So I thought I'd make a PowerPoint. It's very low effort, but it'll be something to keep in the background. So yeah, I mean, let's just get started. All right. So first thing we're introduced to in this story is this brilliant character, um, who I'm going to say might be my favorite character in the series, and that is Sandman. So Sandman is a Native American in 1890, who is just, he's trying to help his tribe out. His tribe are in obviously a dangerous position because they're Native Americans. In the 1800s, they're being persecuted against. Their land is being taken from them for its resources, etc., etc. And he finds out about a countrywide horse race with a big fat prize pool, which he has decided to enter. And I think it's really fitting that this is the first character we meet. So Sandman isn't the protagonist. I think that's really important to note. And you don't really go into it thinking he is, but he is still who they choose to first frame as a character. And that works really well because his motivation is by far the most sympathetic, with maybe one exception of all of the races that we meet in the story. It's completely reasonable to want to use the money for this. It's in fact completely good. It's a completely good act. And additionally, what makes Sandman so appealing is that he doesn't even use a horse. He just runs faster than horses. He's like the fastest person ever, probably. Um, and it's just an excellent sight. Sandman is a great character, and we'll get into him more later when he becomes relevant to the story. But for now, all you need to know is he has a great setup. I was rooting for him to win when the race started, and he is depicted as the first character we see. So he is set up to play a really important role and be a major player in this race. Um, Moving on, we are then actually introduced to the race, which is being hosted by this guy, Stephen Steele. I do have the full thing here. It is 6,000 kilometers, roughly, and the price is $50 million, which I assume, this is $1890, so I'm assuming it's worth much more than that now, right? Um, it's a ridiculous amount of money for a horse race, and yeah. Other things we learn, we actually get a good bit of characterization for Stephen here. He's very, very worried about the race not being perceived well in some way, and he complains about it to his wife, who, as it turns out, is 14 years old. Now, the good news is, while at first the obvious assumption is, okay, this is like an awful, horrible human who's like a really creepy guy, there actually is a reasonable explanation for this marriage. He isn't at all romantically or sexually attracted to her, thank God. Um, and he's more doing it to keep her safe because he, in his eyes, owes her a debt because she basically like motivated him to become this sort of event organizer that he is and that we see him as in this story. So thankfully, uh, he's not a really creepy guy, but the issue I have with this is it does take more than half of the manga for that to be stated. Up until that point, it just seems really quite creepy, in spite of there being nothing creepy going on. And it really, really, really kind of freaks me out. And I sort of think that is an issue, because they do really try to depict him as somewhat sympathetic, but of course that doesn't really work. He's seemingly a pedophile, right? And that's no good. Um, that's really all I have to say here. And the race in terms of format, is it the most interesting format? Is it the most original concept for a story or even for a manga? No, of course it isn't. But it's really interesting. It's a great framework. It has so much potential to be successful, and of course, it is really successful. Um, so yeah, on premise, I like it, and it keeps the structure very simple geographically, which is always something that Araki likes to do. He likes to keep the geography, the physical locations they go between, simple until it gets really, really nuts at the end, right? And this is once again a great example of that. Um, Here we go. So we're introduced to three early candidates for the win, three of the strongest riders in this race, who play varyingly important roles. We'll start with this guy in the middle. His name is Dot Han, and he is like a Mongolian, like horse warrior type of fella. He is almost entirely irrelevant to the story, and he's killed around the halfway mark, um, and he's not really actually that competitive, unlike the other two here, who are clearly top level horse riders. So to start, we have Mountain Tim. This guy I saw when I was getting the pictures for the PowerPoint is apparently the speedwagon of this timeline, which I think is worth establishing here because I sort of forgot to mention that this is basically a retelling of part one, but in this alternate timeline. Um, and I did say that I thought there were no more stands in this timeline when I was talking about the end of part 6, but I'm wrong. There are plenty of stands in this story. There are very few humanoid stands, though. There are only really 3, which is, of course, noteworthy. And then, of course, probably notably, if you haven't seen the manga and for some reason you're watching this, you can probably already tell that this is Dio under the name Diego Brando, which I don't think was his name before, but I don't really remember. But either way, Diego Brando, he's a British guy. He rose through the ranks from quite a peasant spot, and now he's a top horse rider. and he's coming to win the race. And these three are established as, in the eyes of the spectators of the race and the commentators, these are the top choices to win the race. However, of course, the commentators don't know all, like, however many, I think it's like 4,000 people enter the race. They don't know them all. So there are quite a few people who they miss. And the first of these, and the most notable, and the most famous face from this part of the series, is the wonderful. I'm and I'm about. I was about to just go into it. We were going so well, and then I was like, shit, I don't actually know how you pronounce his name. So I'm gonna go for Gyro because obviously he's named as in the word gyrate, which is pronounced with a J sound. But I think in my head I've been saying gyro quite a bit, so I'm gonna have to switch that up a bit. And I apologize if I switch between the two or anything. But yeah, we'll go for gyro. One of these is Gyro Zappelli, whose real name is Caesar Zappelli. So they're pretty, they're pretty on the nose with who this is a parallel for in this new universe. Um, And Gyro is the deuteragonist. He's the partner to Jojo, number 7, I guess. He is from Naples, and we'll talk more about his origin later, but the important thing here to establish right now is that he's in possession of these steel balls, which he can spin at incredibly high velocities without really even like moving his hand or throwing them in some sort of fancy way. He's basically just using like the rotation of his palm. I'm not very good at explaining these powers and how all his interactions work, so I apologize. But this is like uh, he can make the ball spin really fast and then throw it at people, and that can actually cause them to like spin around or have their like flesh spin around. And he accidentally puts the ball near this kid in a wheelchair, who we'll talk about in a second. But that is our Jojo, and when he touches the ball while it's still spinning, he is able to stand. In spite of the fact that he's lost use of his legs, and that is how they meet. But we'll get into that in a second because I believe we also need to talk about, yes, we also need to talk about Poco Loco, another of my favorite characters in this part. So Poco Loco is essentially this sort of laissez-faire idealist. He doesn't really want to do work, he just wants to laze around and hope that he kind of gets lucky in life. And he, in fact, has a stand uh, ooh, called Hey Ya, as in the Outcast song, because of course Araki, full of the music references, he always does it. Um, which is basically, it's just a stand that is incredibly lucky. It makes him really lucky, and he decides to enter the race as a complete unknown, same as Gyro. Um, and he is another top competitor. At the beginning of the race, it's relatively clear that the only 5 people really with a shot of winning are Sandman, Poco Loco, Gyro, Johnny, and Dio. Everyone else is at least competitive. Like there are other people who are close, but these 5 are like clearly sort of on another level, and we'll get into that in a second. But either way, Poco Loco is another person we're established early. We understand his motivation. We know where he's from. We know, roughly what he's experienced. He's a young man. He was probably born at around the time slavery was abolished, but of course, he is still a black man. He still very clearly faces persecution. That's like something that's naturally implied. And for that reason, I think it's worth saying um, that him and Sandman have another layer of sympathy to them because of this. They're both people who face severe persecution within the United States, so it would be considerably lovelier symbolically to see them get all this money. Which is why, in the end, when the race started, as much as I liked Gyro and Johnny, and even Dio to some degree, even though we hadn't really seen him much, he has that aura, it's Dio. These were the two that I was rooting for the most. Um, and, foreshadowing here, I'll get ahead of myself, but it did end up paying off in this case. And then finally, we have our protagonist, Johnny Joestar, who is introduced surprisingly late into the story, considering that we've established Sandman and Gyro and Dio and Poco Loco at this point, as well as other significant characters who aren't clearly significant yet, like Steele's 14-year-old wife. for example. So, as I've already established, Johnny was a horse rider, in this case American. He was born in America, that he's no longer British. He was a good horse rider, but he got a bit cocky, and then he was in a fight, which resulted in him losing the use of his legs, and now he's confined to a wheelchair. And he just came to the race to see it. He wasn't planning on racing, but upon having Gyro's ball make him stand, he realized there might be a chance that he would be able to walk again, and decides to enter the race. And he's even able to like mount a horse and such, and start the race. And of course, once he's on the horse, he's a proven jockey, and he's an incredibly competitive person. And him and Gyro become good friends, and their duo is the main thing we follow throughout this story, especially at the start because the main B plot hasn't even been established yet. And one thing I think might be true of Johnny is that compared to some of the other characters in this particular part, he isn't exactly the most noticeable. But what I think is also true is that he is a more human protagonist than the first five JoJos. So the first five JoJos, and I sort of maybe touched on this a little bit in part six, but not especially heavily, they're all so steadfast in their motivations, and they have so one like clear goal, and really basically everything in the long run does go their way. They might face hardship, but they always are able to overcome it with relative quickly. They don't go into huge low points at any point in their life. And the way that that changed was in part six with Jolene, and Johnny is yet another example of that. Because, of course, Jolene didn't necessarily have a good life to begin with. Her dad was absent, though, of course, he was like protecting her, blah, 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 blah. And she ended up being quite an antisocial individual and eventually ending up in prison, though unfairly. And that is a clear, huge low point for her to enter, which is just not the case of any of the characters in the first five parts. And Johnny is in the same boat because he's been paralyzed, I would assume, for a couple of years at least, and he remains paralyzed for the entirety of the race. He might be able to ride a horse, but he isn't able to walk. If he gets off the horse at any point, he's now confined to his wheelchair, which he often just has, which I don't really understand. Like, is he carrying the wheelchair on the horse? I don't think he is, but whatever. Let's not get into that. Maybe they're just selling wheelchairs everywhere in 1890s America. Either way, these are the main players that narratively are shown when we enter the race. We've got Sandman, we've got Gyro, we've got Johnny, Poco Loco, and Dio. These people like Mountain Tim and Dot Han, as much as they look interesting, they're very clearly not being set up to be as competitive in the race as these main five, even if that's what the commentators say, blah 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 blah. And I think it's really excellent that we get five people, only one of whom isn't likable, right? Dio, we know it's Dio. He's probably not a good person, and he's also just seems like a bit annoying. Like, a British aristocrat in the modern day, nobody really likes that sort of fusty, posh attitude and things like that. So it's very obvious that he's not like likable. But the other four are all relatively sympathetic. So there's clearly like a conflict of interest here. Like, you don't know who you're necessarily rooting for particularly. Now, for me, I think Sandman was my hard line. Like, I'm pushing for him to win because I not just because like he deserves the win, but more because he deserves the money more than the other three people. The other three people could really use the win, like it could really help them out in the long term, but the money isn't necessarily going to go anywhere particularly helpful for any of them. Whereas for Sandman, it is. So for me, Sandman was who I was rooting for, but I really didn't mind. I would have happily seen any of the other three of those, excluding Dio, win the race. So yeah, that's just, important stuff to establish. And then we get the race. So I forgot to mention this earlier, but the race is divided into 9 stages, and each stage has a different ranking. And really, what matters is coming consistently high in every single stage. Um, this first stage is, of course, as you can see at the top, it's only 15,000 meters. It's the shortest stage. It's very, very short. And we get quite a big um, competitive thing. We follow the entire race. It's very close. Everyone's all bunched together. And as you can see from the results, there's a relatively reasonable looking top 5, with the exception of Mountain Tim being in here, except for Gyro, who finished in 21st. Now, I'll talk about why he's in 21st in a bit. But to start, I think it's important to know that I was really fucking happy here, right? Sandman like won. He came first. It was excellent. I was cheering. I was really happy. Yay! Um, and Dio came second, and Piccolo came third. It basically came as no surprise who actually finished at the top, except for Mountain Tim, who I was sort of expecting to fade into the background to some degree, but that's fine. Importantly, though, the actual winner of the race in terms of who passed the line first is actually Gyro. He won the race. He was the fastest and he finished in first because he used the steel ball to make his horse run faster by like spinning its hind legs. I guess. I don't really know how else to describe it, but that's what he did. Um, and he won, but unfortunately, he was fouled for reasons that I'm embarrassed to say. I don't really remember, but I believe it probably involves injuring. I'm gonna take a guess and say it was Dio, but I'm not entirely certain. Either way, first stage is done, and they're on to the second stage. This one is much longer. It basically is them crossing the Mojave Desert. Um, and it ends in I've forgotten the name of it. That's not great, but whatever. It's the second stage, and this is where we start to get introduced to the stands. So up until this point, I wasn't certain that there would be any stands. We hadn't seen any stands. We'd seen Poco Loco's like Lucky Lady thing, but that wasn't like named as a stand or anything, so it's not certain. And the steel balls aren't a stand. That's just something that Gyro can do. So we haven't seen any stands up until this point, but then we do start to get introduced to them here, and that is oh shit. Ignore that. I was supposed to talk about the Steven Steel stuff there, but I ended up getting distracted and talk about it. Anyway, the first four stand users we meet. So the first one we meet is this lady here called Mrs. Robinson. It might be a dude, but his name is Mrs. Robinson, so I'm gonna say it's not. Importantly, she slash he. I don't even remember the powers. It's irrelevant. They're beaten in about 5 seconds. It's not competitive, and they're basically pointless. It's just there to establish there are stand users. The real threat at the beginning of this story is these three, the Boom Boom brothers, who have the power to control iron, specifically. Sort of similar to something like Magneto, um, but it's not quite as potent. They're not quite as strong as him. Um, and yeah, they're a family. They've got the father over here on the right, and then these two are his. I think they're both his sons. Um, and this one is Andre, and he is the strongest. And I don't remember the other two's names. It's not particularly important what they do. They're not very threatening. They get beaten quite easily. They are beaten by Johnny and Gyro, who are now being targeted very clearly for unknown reasons by a group of people. Mountain Tim comes in and aids the pair. He is also a stand user. He has a stand where he can disconnect parts of his body and they remain connected by like rope. So think like Buggy's fruit, but with rope attaching everything together. Um, it's a pretty good stand and it's used to help defeat these three, and they move on. There's not much else to say here. These four are just here to say, just to remind us that stands exist in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Um, and there's not much else to say um, in that regard. Where it starts to get interesting is with Oya Kamova. So this guy has a relatively simple and not particularly like incredible stand. It's not like this can be used in that many different ways, but it is still very potent, and he's the first real threat of the story. So his stand is that his skin is explosive, and so basically you shouldn't touch it. But also basically everything else he touches can become explosive, I think. So he's like a bomb. He's basically a bomb guy. He can blow things up. That's a simple way of putting it. Doesn't really matter what the technicalities are. He can blow stuff up if you get to touch certain things or go too near him, etc. Now I'm going to be honest. It was a really long time ago when I read the first part of this, basically the first two stages of the race. Then I had to go away, and then I read basically the rest of it in like 4 days because it was really good. Um, so I can't remember how this guy's defeated either, but I do remember that it actually involved some level of technicality, and it meant that Mountain Tim was injured severely enough that he had to drop out of the race, though he didn't die because he will return later. But yeah, he had to drop out of the race incredibly early, which is quite disappointing. Um, and yeah, it's a pretty good encounter. It's a pretty good starting encounter, although I can't remember the specifics. I do remember vibing out with it, and of course that design. I haven't mentioned this yet, but this is the best drawn part by like a mile. Everything in this is gorgeous. The way all the characters look is gorgeous. The framing of the panels is incredible. Um, I was frequently just, reading it and going, and I had to just stop and like really look at the art, which is rare for me in manga in general, and it has not really happened at all in the first six parts of JJPA, as much as they're very well drawn. It's just not been that well framed. But here it really blew me away. Everything about this was just incredible, and you will see there's some of the panels that I've screenshotted for this are just amazing. So yeah, some of them aren't particularly stand out. These ones aren't particularly impressive, in fairness. But I'm just here to establish a number of things. So first of all, we get a first real fan service parallel, because this guy is the this equivalent of Stroheim. I'm not sure why you'd want an equivalent of Stroheim, considering that he is like the worst character ever, because he's a Nazi and for some reason he's still treated sympathetically. But here he is nonetheless, and of course in this case he's not a Nazi, so I guess it's almost like an apology, in a way. This isn't the important thing, I just put him there to remind me that he's there. We also do have the actual origin of Gyro and why he's competing in the race, and the reason is for the sake of this boy. So this boy was a servant to some sort of nobleman in Naples, and their family all got arrested for conspiring to kill the monarchy. And because he was a servant there, he was on the chopping block as well, even though he was just a boy. And Gyro was like, "Well, fuck you, that's not right. He's not involved. He wasn't conspiring or anything." But his dad, who is the executioner for the king, is like, well, no, 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 blah, blah, blah. And then for some reason, the condition emerges that if he wins the race, he will be able to free this boy. I can't really remember specifics because, again, I read it quite a while ago, this part, but it is the case. Then, perhaps more notably, we get an explanation as to why stands exist in this world, and it's not for the same reason. There's no masks or arrows or anything like that. In this case, the parts of a saint were scattered all over America um, for people to find, and if you come across them, even if you don't actually take the parts themselves, you'll probably get a stand. And the race, as you can probably see, is tracing where all the body parts are. And as it turns out, the president of the US, who helped organize the race, is trying to get all of the parts of the saint and put them together so that he has loads and loads of power, and that's why this happens. And so Johnny ends up taking the right arm of the saint into his own right arm and gets a stand called Tusk, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Um, but more importantly, we now know why the race is happening, what the long-term goal is, and who the villain is. But I'll talk more about Funny Valentine, who is the president, much later because he is absolutely excellent. Um, and of course, it's worth noting that the implication is that the saint here is Jesus, but his name is never actually said, I don't think, in the manga. They never say it's Jesus. They do show um, a man who looks like traditional sort of old European paintings of Jesus with the crown of thorns. But, it could technically be some other saint. But it's probably Jesus. It is probably Jesus' body parts spread all over the country. So moving on, we then get our first real threat, and the first really great fight um, of the story, and that is the fight with the pork pie hat kid, a name unknown. I did check, we don't know his name. This kid is trying to get the arm for the president. It's the guy on the left, if it's not already kind of clear. He has a really cool stand, which I really like, which is that he can produce ropes from objects and use them to hook things into the object, and then they get teleported back to him, which he uses to straight up steal Gyro and incapacitate him. And also Johnny's horse, which means that in this fight, Johnny is basically relying on outsmarting him because he can't physically win it. He's not on a horse, so he can't even walk, which is a great way of making a threat. I think that's what's so great about Johnny. He's so vulnerable, but he's always able to succeed because he is disabled. He's in a serious, handicap, but he's always able to overcome it, and I think that's quite nice. I think it really is. Um, Excellent. Anyway, this pork pie hat kid, I think the way he's beaten is because Johnny's stand, which is basically the ability to make his nails spin really fast and then shoot them like a gun. He shoots his nails into the object the rope is coming out of, and that shoots the pork pie hat guy in the face. And then I think there's a couple more like sort of outsmarting steps to it, but that's basically how it goes. And then we finally get to actually meet the president. And if you can't tell which one it is, it's this guy in the middle. These two are like his assistants or whatever, and his name is Funny Valentine, and he's already in possession of the heart. Uh, we'll say Jesus' heart. I know it's not established to be his heart, like we don't know it's Jesus, but let's just say it's Jesus for the sake of the video, taking less time. Um, yeah. In terms of design, at first it does seem as though this isn't a particularly physically threatening individual compared to some of the other villains we've had in the past. Look at like Part 3 Dio, or Kira, or uh, what's his name? The guy, Diavolo. They're all considerably physically stronger, and even Poochie looks at it as well. But as it turns out, this guy is incredibly muscular and incredibly fit, and in fact, across the course of the manga, he also gets progressively taller and thinner. So that's sort of a weird change that was made. I'm sort of assuming that this is because Araki changed his mind. I think this is true of a couple of other things as well, because this is also where we really start to see a dip in the usage of Poco Loco and Sandman. They start to take a more background role because the focus less becomes on who's going to win the race and more on who's going to find the corpse parts. And Poco Loco and Sandman aren't interested in the corpse parts. Um, so yeah, oh, there's the heart. Anyway, the second stage is finished, and the winner is Dio. Um, then Johnny, Sandman, Gyro, and Hot Pants, who we'll talk about later. Anyway, blah blah blah. I believe Poco Loco is sixth. Um, but yeah. Um, Not much else to say there, and I already established that he has the heart. But of course, as you can see here, this isn't a particularly muscular or physically threatening presence necessarily, but later on you will see he becomes much more physically threatening. Anyway, here is someone who is interested in the corpse parts, and that is Dio. So Dio unintentionally gains his stand ability because of this guy on the left, whose name is Ferdinand. This guy has the stand ability to turn people into dinosaurs, and he turns Dio into a dinosaur, but then he's defeated, and Dio retains the power to be able to turn into a dinosaur, and he can also make other objects. I think it might be limited to living organisms, but I'm not entirely sure, turn into dinosaurs who are his subordinates. Um, and this is where we really start to see that Dio is like, he's the core rival here. He may not be a villain, he's not necessarily trying to kill Johnny and Gyro, but what he is trying to do is get the corpse parts for himself. He's a third party interested in the corpse, who eventually does decide to work with Valentine, if only briefly. Oh, oh fuck, excuse me. Anyway, that's all there is to say. This third stage is then completed. This third stage is sort of through the Rocky Mountains. And as you can see, the winner here by a relatively considerable margin is Hot Pants, a character we haven't even been introduced to. And so, of course, we now get to learn about Hot Pants. So Hot Pants is a slightly unusual character, sort of personality-wise. As it turns out, she's pretending to be a man, but she's actually a woman. And we later also learn that she's from the Vatican, and is in some way related to Gyro. But for now, the only important thing to note is that she has a stand ability, which is a sort of spray, but the spray that comes out of this like spray bottle is flesh, and she can use it to disguise herself or heal wounds and things like that. And we learn of all this power in an encounter with Ringo Rodigan. This is a character who I have seen gets a lot of love compared to a lot of sort of one-off antagonists, even in this part of JoJo's. He's very, very beloved, and I'm gonna be honest, as much as I think he has an interesting origin story and childhood that they show, he isn't an exceptionally interesting character in his own right. We meet him because he kills one of the other races called Gaucho, who was sort of, I think he is on the board. Let me go back and check. Yeah, he finished 10th. He kills this guy, and it's also established that he has a stand, and that stand ability is that he can rewind time for 6 seconds. It's a pretty classic sort of thing. There are lots of other cases where people can rewind time and things, but yeah, he can rewind time. He can go back 6 seconds, and he uses that to trap not Dio, Gyro, Johnny, and Hot Pants in place. He keeps rewinding time so they can't travel anywhere, and the only way they can beat it is to kill him, which he himself says he knows that if Johnny really put the effort in, he would be able to do it, but Gyro won't be, and in the end, Gyro is the only person who isn't incapacitated by him, meaning that he has to undergo a significant character shift where he basically becomes considerably more determined in order to defeat Ringo. And we also get an interesting origin for him and why he has the philosophy he has, which is basically just that he's fucking around, trying to get the corpse parts for Valentine. But more importantly, he has this sort of belief that you need to be like determined, I guess. And it's established that what happened to him as a child, which is absolutely crazy, is that when he was a child, a sort of Civil War soldier broke into his house and tried to rape him, which is obviously really, really, really wild. And he ended up killing him before he got the opportunity, and he was maybe like, I'm gonna guess 7 or 8. It's a really, really dark thing. It's not something you would have seen in the first 7 parts because it's shonen. It's excellently handled, and it really does explain why he is the way he is. This is somebody who is significantly broken and fucked up, and of course, that's really traumatizing. Even if nothing particularly, like, absolutely, utterly vile happened to him, it's still really awful to understand that implication. And of course, I picked this panel of him dying because it's absolutely gorgeous. This is one of the best panels, hands down. Look at this thing. It's so well drawn, and the color and everything about it is just wonderful. I absolutely love it. Anyway, the next stand user they have to face is somebody working directly under the president, and this is where the B plot finally starts to get rolling. So this is Blackmore, whose power is basically that he can walk on rain and turn into liquid in the rain. Um, and he has to wear this mask while his stand ability is active. The reason we meet Blackmore is that Lucy Steele, Stephen's 14-year-old wife, learns about Funny Valentine having the heart, and then learns to lip read, and then she decides, because she thinks her and her husband might be in danger, and she decides to break into the president's offices and steal his pigeon messages from Ringo, who sent a message warning him about how Gyro and Johnny had defeated him and how they had some of the corpse parts. I think they have at this point gotten the eyes. Maybe I'm gonna be honest. I'm terrible at tracking when they get the parts, but they slowly get the parts. Anyway, Valentine realizes that something is up, and then that somebody has stolen this message because he needs to read it. And hum, I just had a complete my mind just blanked randomly. Anyway, Blackmore is then hunting down the intruder, and of course Lucy doesn't have any sort of stand ability, but she is rescued by a now fully recovered Mountain Tim. Unfortunately for Tim, as you can probably see in front of you, although you can't see his face, he is then quite quickly killed by Blackmore, which is an excellent way of establishing that this guy is seriously dangerous. Um, and I mean, he's kind of cool as fuck. Like, look how cool this guy is. His power is cool, and he uses so cool. Like, look on the left. This guy is so, like, smooth with his movements. It's absolutely awesome. and I really think he's one of my favorite antagonists in this part. I prefer him to Ringo, to be honest. I don't really get why people like Ringo so much. I mean, he has an interesting origin, but he's not especially cool power-wise or personality-wise. But Blackmore really has all these things going for him. He's significantly more interesting to me. Either way, Lucy needs is trying to go get the spine, which is located near Chicago, which is where the end of the fourth stage is. And Dio also knows it's in this spot near Chicago, as do Johnny and Gyro, and they're following Dio. Um, and there's a sort of semi-fight between them. Dio is really, really fast because of his like dinosaur vision, and so he keeps evading them. But eventually Johnny manages to knock him off his horse, but of course Gyro isn't particularly happy with this because he realizes that now Dio is actively going to want to harm them rather than just get the corpse parts as revenge, which isn't necessarily worth it in at all. And then importantly, they run into Lucy, and Blackmore follows Lucy and attacks her, and he is defeated because Jesus decides to step in and say something to Blackmore, causing him to get distracted and realize what's really going on, and celebrate because he realizes that if the president is able to get a hold of this, he really will be unstoppable. And he is like a really big devoted fan of the president. Um, However, when he hesitates because of this, he is shot and killed, um, which is an excellent way of beating him, in my opinion. As much as if it's not like a straight overpowering, it's great at doing several things. It's great at establishing the fact that it definitely is Jesus. It's great at establishing how devoted some of these people are to the president. These people who really love him. And of course, it's useful because Lucy is the one who shoots him, and this establishes her role. Lucy is now going to continuously try to steal the parts the president already has, which is notably the heart, but also later he comes into possession of several other parts, which Lucy needs to take back. And that is the main B plot of the story while we follow Gyro and Johnny in the actual race. Um, yeah. After this, we get to the end of the fourth stage, and this guy, Norisuke Higashikata, mysteriously manages to push his way to first place in the stage. Um, this is, of course, a bit shocking, and unfortunately, he isn't really a character worth discussing. He has basically no role. He briefly speaks to people, and from what I've read, um, his daughter is going to be Johnny's future wife, which I believe we'll see in some way in part 8. But really, he isn't actually important to the story, and I think it was really disappointing and felt a bit like a loose end to me because why was there such a focus on the fact that he finished in first all of a sudden? He kind of came out of nowhere, and it feels really weird. I think that's reasonable to say, right? Whew. Um, but yeah, uh, not much else to really add here. We also get an origin story for Johnny. We get to learn about his childhood. So he grew up in a relatively wealthy household. This is a classic thing, true of part one as well. He had an older brother named Nicholas, who was also a really excellent jockey, and Nicholas ended up dying in a tragic accident, which Dio was actually present for, though of course he didn't do anything. I think we can be relatively sure of that. He was around for it. And Johnny blames himself because the reason the horse fell and killed him was because it saw a mouse, and the night before he was told to drown his pet mouse, but instead he freed him and let him escape into the woods. So he blames himself because he thinks it's the same mouse, which is of course incredibly unlikely and kind of a really stupid way of thinking, but nevertheless it's what it's what he comes to the conclusion about. Well, that was really poorly said. Ugh. Anyway, we learn this right after the fourth part, where Dio agrees to try and help defeat Gyro and Johnny with the help of somebody, a Stan user who the president recently paid to help him as well. who is seen as a mystery, but it turns out to be Sandman, and this is where I really get to say how much I really, really like this character, Sandman. Now, unfortunately, he does die here, and I wish we got to see more of him after this, but he sadly isn't able to. He's killed by Johnny, but it is incredibly tragic. The story of Sandman is that of a tragedy. Um, so we've already established that Sandman has an incredibly sympathetic motivation to win the race, and as he himself states, the only reason that he's trying to kill, um, ugh, the only reason he's trying to kill, Johnny and Gyro is because he needs to save his tribe. He's looking out for his own here. The reason he has to kill is because of the sort of incredibly unnecessarily important role that money plays in society at this point in time, and indeed it still does now. It's very much reflective of modern day attitudes regarding money a lot of the time. People who are undeniably good will do bad things in order to keep the people they love safe in a financial sense, and that is absolutely the case with Sandman as well. It's incredibly tragic, and I can honestly say that Sandman is my favorite character in this part, and therefore in the entirety of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure because of this. I could talk about this for fucking ages, I think, if you really got me going, but there isn't that much else to say here. All I'll say is that this is absolutely excellent. It's my favorite fight from a narrative sense, and Sandman has a pretty cool stand where he can like attach sound effects to objects. In this case, he does it with Dio's dinosaurs. However, it's obviously a real shame that he ended up getting taken out so early in the race. I would have loved to see him win, or at least I would have loved some sort of establishment that his tribe ended up alright. We never get to learn that, and it's almost basically presumed that his tribe ended up getting fucked over and continued to face the incredibly bad persecution they were already facing because Sandman wasn't able to get the money he needed either from the president or from winning the race, which is really upsetting, and we never get to see any sort of conclusion regarding that. I think it kind of sucks, and it feels a bit like a loose end. It's not the only character who ends up feeling like a loose end. I already established Higashikata, but there are other people we'll get into shortly as well, who are also really not concluded to the degree that I would personally like. As much as he dies, we don't establish what happens to the world around him, his personal world, and that kind of sucks. Anyway, again, another stage done, the fifth stage, and this one is won by Poco Loco, and now Sandman is taken out, and things really start to shift. Poco Loco, who I think in the overall standings was about fifth before, now is happily sitting in first, and Gyro is still down in sixth. He's very clearly not that likely to um, finish highly here, right? So yeah, kind of a shame. Anyway, there's not much else to say there. We now move into the north of the states. We're going up the west side of Lake Michigan rather, and we encounter a new character. This one being Sugar Mountain. So Sugar is a girl who's stuck in a tree, and the tree is a stand user, which is in possession of the ears of the corpse. And the way the tree works is if something lands in the water surrounding the tree, then Sugar will present it and a better version of it and ask you to take which one fell in the water. But if you take the bad one, you get killed by the tree. But every single, not the bad one. If you take the one that you didn't throw in, basically. If you tell the truth, you get given both items, but you have to use the new item you've been gifted, the good version, and they end up with not just the ears, but also a lot of money, a diamond, a big hunk of gold, and some other crap that they have to get rid of in the next town over, which is also a problem because they're being hunted down by this stand user whose name is literally 11 Men, which I think is a slightly unusual name for a stand, but either way. It's one of the most boring stand users, but of course that's made up for the fact that they're under threat of not using all the items, and if they don't use all the items, they get turned into part of the tree. But of course they do, and everyone is freed from the tree, including Sugar Mountain's parents who were trapped there, which is an excellent way to end it for her. We don't need to see her again, and it's quite a happy ending. And also they get possession of the ears, which is always excellent too. Um, we then move over to the B plot. We get another of the president's guards trying to stop Lucy from infiltrating. In this case, it is Mike O or Mark O, maybe. Somebody O. Um, this guy here. His ability is to blow up objects like balloons and use them to attack people. And Hot Pants, who has now retired from the race in order to focus on collecting the corpse parts, which she stole the spine and some of the other parts from Johnny, by the way, after the fight with Sandman because they were so injured, is now aiding Lucy by disguising her as the First Lady, who is also killed coincidentally at around the same time. Unfortunately, it means that Lucy is now stuck pretending to be the First Lady for a prolonged period of time because Hot Pants can't actually get her out of the place the President is staying in. Though he is able. Why am I saying he? I'm embarrassed by myself there. Though she is able to beat Mr. O um, relatively easily. This is obviously really great, by the way. It's like a sort of espionage thing that you don't normally see in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It's normally just straight fighting, and I think it was handled really well. Araki really does know what he's doing here. Now we get two excellent additions to our enemy stand user cast. This is another of my favorite fights, not just because of how good the action is, because of the narrative of it. And it's all because of this guy on the right. So on the left we have Magenta. This guy has a stand which basically means he can't move while it's active, but he also can't take damage. He's beaten relatively simply, and he's not particularly important, though it's established that he does survive the fight. The important person here is Waka Pipo, this guy on the right with the polka dots. So as you might be able to see, this guy has a steel ball of his own, only it's orange instead of Gyro's green, and he's also from Naples, but rather than being an executioner, he was a part of the Royal Guard, and his ball does something slightly different. So Gyro's ball is technically the most powerful when thrown correctly. If you throw it using the Pythagorean golden ratio, it is more powerful and it will break Wakapipo's steel ball. But Wakapipo's steel ball can split into small parts, and if the small parts hit you, well, it creates a shockwave, and the shockwave makes the left half of your body seem invisible, and it also means you can't see anything on your left side, and importantly, that's where Magenta is in the fight. Wakapipo is defeated, but he isn't killed, and he agrees to help protect Lucy from the president, while Gyro and Johnny can't because they're continuing to do the race. And of course, they don't know that Hot Pants is kind of already doing that. And it's just, yeah, excellent fight, excellent conflict. Gyro's dad actually exiled Wakapipo from Naples a really long time ago, so it's an attempted revenge thing, but he understands that it's actually not really Gyro who did it, and it's maybe not even a bad thing that he was kicked out particularly, and they sort of reconcile, and it's just an excellent bit of narrative writing. Um, Sixth stage, blah 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 blah. At this point, it's not particularly important. All you need to know is that Poco Loco is still in first. Yeah. Okay. This was my least favorite um, fight, although narratively it's quite strong. The stand kind of, I just didn't like it. I don't know what else to say. So this guy's stand is that um, things that you've sacrificed will come back and attack you, but it just feels like it doesn't make particularly strong amount of sense because of some of the things they brought back, like a knife he threw away because it was broken. Does that really count as a sacrifice? But also, that's not the most effective way of using this. You could easily kill somebody incredibly quickly by bringing back everything they've ever sacrificed all at the same time and just throwing it at them. But whatever. I didn't particularly enjoy it, and this guy was just kind of annoying, and they tried to make him seem somewhat sympathetic because he was like, he accidentally didn't warn people when he was like a lookout that the enemy were coming in the Civil War, and then this town was destroyed, and he kind of blames himself, and that means that all the soldiers who died in that fight are like working for him now as his sacrifices and stuff. It's all a bit weird, and I honestly think they shouldn't have gone for this like super detailed and sympathetic origin for this guy because he's kind of monstrous in terms of his actual attitude. He's a really horrible individual, unlike someone like Ringo, who's more just like broken, I guess. And it doesn't really work. All I'm feeling is, yeah, this guy's horrible, so what? Like, I don't really care about the fact that he did something stupid and regrets it or whatever. He's a really horrible, malicious individual, and I don't really want to see him succeed in any way. I don't want him to have, like, a satisfying end, which kind of sucks. Hot Pants is here as well, and we learn about her origin, which is excellent comparatively, because it's incredibly sad. So when she was a child, her and her younger brother were attacked by a bear while they were trapped in a small cave, and she ended up pushing him into the bear so the bear would kill him and she could run away, which is of course a really severe thing, and it would definitely haunt you for the rest of your life. But at the same time, it's almost a question of like, what else would there be to do? The bear wasn't going to stop attacking them. Now, I'm not saying it's what she did is like correct here, but it's certainly you could argue otherwise. I do think it's wrong, but there's like a conflict being created here, which I think is interesting. So really, I think more of the focus should have been on that. We also get a big load of Jesus in this part. He basically is trying to guide Johnny into shooting himself in the head, because if he shoots himself in the head, he'll have sacrificed himself, and then he'll be freed from the stand ability. And it also results in Johnny being able to turn his hand into like a sort of wormholey thing that he can travel around, meaning that he can shoot remotely, and he's no longer as burdened by his inability to walk, which is an excellent way of progressing his ability, and I'm a big fan of it. Um, yeah. So this is where things start to get really confusing, and I'm gonna be honest, I'm gonna stop going into the details of the action full stop at all. All you need to know here is that Magent comes back, tries to kill Steven Steele, but Weka Pipo shows up and they have a fight and Magent is killed. Um, it's important to establish that this is really there to really hone in. Weka Pipo is now on the good guy's side, and additionally to resolve um, the sort of conflict of interest here because him and Magent are kind of like buddies, right? They fight, he kills him, it's over. Kind of end of story. I just have this here really to establish that it happened. It's not particularly important, it's not something I need to talk about. The next part of this story, though, is probably my favorite sequence aside from the fight with Sandman. Um, so this part is just Lucy basically slowly being more and more obviously not the First Lady to Valentine. And he works out who she is and why she's here, and then he chases her away, and then she hides in this room and she finds all of the corpse parts because after they defeated the sacrifice guy, Valentine showed up and took the entire corpse except for the head. Um, and then it's incredibly creepy and disturbing because he's trying to have sex with her, but obviously she's a 14-year-old, and it's really fucking dark, but it really hits well. I mean, it sounds weird to say, but it really does. It succeeds incredibly effectively. It's super tense and terrifying to watch. And eventually, what he realizes is because she touched the corpse, Jesus basically chose her and made her pregnant with his head, which is really weird, but it's what happens. I don't know what else to tell you. But yeah, this was easily, without a doubt, my favorite sequence aside from the Sandman fight. It was super great. It wasn't overly complicated, which often happens towards the end of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, where I can't really follow along with what's happening action-wise. And I mean, yeah, it's just so tense. Oh my God, it was such a great moment. I had to read it like 3 times. But yeah, excellent, 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 excellent. However, after this, it starts to get a bit weird. So first we have this guy who fights Gyro. This guy is really, really forgettable, but I will say I think it might be intentional. The point here is that Gyro beats him really easily, but while he's not looking, Johnny is shot and nearly killed, and a fight goes on with the actual president. But Gyro can't participate because he's distracted by this boring ass guy. I couldn't even tell you what this guy's powers are. I know it's obviously going to involve the thing on his wrist, but other than that, beyond me. But yeah, it's an important. He's like a narrative device, I guess. He works really well as a narrative device, even if as a character he's absolutely rubbish. Then we get a fight where Wekapipo, Dio, and Johnny all fight Funny Valentine, and we finally learn about his stand, which is the ability to travel to different universes and swap out his bodies. He can also bring back other people, and if two people from the different universes who are the same person, so say there's two, well, I'll just give an example that happens. There's two Wekapipos, and they touch each other, and they both die, and Wekapipo is killed in this fight. Of course, he did manage to succeed in protecting Lucy because he kept Magent from going and killing her. So he did actually succeed in what he set out to do when he reconciled with Gyro, which is important to note. Like, he had a complete character arc, and then he died. Dio and Johnny both survive, and Valentine gets away. He then tricks Lucy into like following him onto this boat alongside the now injured Stephen, who's like unconscious, but he's been shot a bunch of times. And he then gets on a train with her, and the finale of this main plot with Funny Valentine is Dio, Hot Pants, Gyro, and Johnny chasing down the train on horse and fighting Valentine, while Lucy slowly transforms into Jesus' corpse. Um, and unfortunately, two of these characters are beaten relatively speedily. Dio is actually the first of the two to die. Um, Valentine transports between universes when he goes between two objects. And unfortunately, while Dio was trying to knock him out of the train, Valentine's hair gets caught between the track and the wheel of the train, and he's able to change universe. And Dio is dragged under the train and ripped in half. Um, which is, first of all, this is absolutely brutal, and the way it's framed is amazing. So you can't really tell from this panel, but you can't in the panels previously where he's talking about how he nearly won slash maybe won. You can't even see that he's been ripped in half. You can only see his top upper half. You can't see the split. And then they move to this panel where they show that he's been split in half, and I'm not joking. It's the only time in this entire series where my jaw dropped. I did not think that Dio would die. I assumed he would finish in like third or fourth, and it really got to me. Hot Pants also dies, and I will say that her death is way too anticlimactic. I barely even realized it happened. When I saw this panel, I thought she was probably going to survive, and then she just never came back. It's one of the few complaints I have, really, for this, other than that there are a couple of things that feel like loose ends. This death didn't have the impact it should have had. Hot Pants is one of the best characters in this, and she basically just dies as an afterthought, which kind of sucks. And then we get into this fight, and I'm not even going to try and explain. But in short, Gyro and Valentine have a trade of blows, and Gyro almost kills Valentine. He does so much damage to Valentine that half of his body turns into like an old man. But unfortunately, he is also killed. This death really, really, really got to me because I was pretty confident that Gyro was going to win because narratively it would only make sense because they've got to save this child, right? But no, he dies, and now this child won't be rescued, which is really quite dark. His death does make sense from the perspective of it helps Johnny finalize his powers and take over, and so in that regard, it closes up both him and Johnny's arcs quite well. He went from somebody who was overconfident but at the same time didn't have any real motivation to do anything, to somebody who was completely motivated and realistic, but unfortunately wasn't quite able to win. He went through an amazing character arc, basically, is what I'm saying. Gyro was really great, and, I was really sad to see him go. Um, Also, yeah, Valentine, at this point in the story, I don't like I'm not a huge fan of the term generally, but he really is aura farming at this point. Basically, every panel with him in, he looks insanely cold. His stand looks amazing, and look at the fucking art. The way the water is moving in this is just ridiculous. There's a lot of shots of the water here because they're at the coast, and it's like bubbling up like this all the time, and it looks incredible. It's such an amazing design choice because, of course, water doesn't actually do that. I don't need to tell you that. It's just absolutely wonderful. Just brilliant. Love it. And then uh, the real win here comes when Johnny Stand turns into this hulking beast, which is truly wonderful. The design of this is incredible to me because it's the first real, incredibly busted humanoid stand, which isn't like a super traditionally fit guy, and I think that's just really interesting. But more importantly, Johnny is the one to defeat Valentine, get the corpse, save Lucy, only then the corpse disappears. Somebody came and took it right after Valentine was defeated. I want to also speak on how Valentine's defeat involved a really lengthy negotiation process where he tries to convince that he can bring Gyro from another universe back so they can be buddies, and he almost tricks Johnny into doing it, but unfortunately he fails and is killed. The issue is, he brought a Dio from a different world back, and this Dio has the world as his stand. Johnny and Dio get into a big fight, and they're also arriving at New York, and they're arriving at the end of the race, and they have the lead. But unfortunately, and surprisingly to me, Johnny is knocked off his horse and disqualifies himself from winning. He doesn't even finish the race, and Dio crosses the line in first. The only issue is Lucy then defeats Dio by getting him to touch the former Dio's corpse, as we already established with Weka Pipo. That kills him. Since he doesn't show up to the prize ceremony, the winner of the race is Poco Loco, the laissez-faire guy who I was rooting for secondarily at the start of the race. And I think that's a wonderful choice. I'm really happy that he won. He gets 50 million and can live his laissez-faire life comfortably. The only issue is this is another loose end. They say that Poco Loco wins, but they don't show his reaction to winning. Not to mention, they don't show what he does afterwards. The issue here is that the way he's framed at the start is that this is a character who, if he survives at the end, we kind of need to know what happens to him. He's clearly shown to be an important character, but he ended up taking a real backseat, especially after Sandman was out of the picture, because the two of them were in a rivalry. I think Poco Loco kind of struggles because his power isn't especially incredible. It's pretty cool to look at, but there isn't a massive amount of variation you can do with it. There's technical variation, but everything will just feel the same whenever he gets lucky. And I think that Araki realized that from early and decided to divert away from him a bit. But the issue is it kind of feels like there isn't any payoff because of that. He wins the race, but we don't get to feel him win the race. We just see it written in text. And that's kind of unfortunate because Poco Loco is one of the more likable characters in this show. Show? Blah. Manga. But yeah, I would say I'm happy he wins, but I wish we got more. And the final thing to touch on is this, which just got me. So I mean, awesome. He gets freed because there's a revolution in Naples and the monarchy is overthrown. and then he died of a cold. I think there's probably some sort of thematic reason for this, but it just feels so unnecessarily cruel, and it just made me go like, what? It was so random. I had to include it here. There were a couple of other weird things that happened that were sort of weird moments of comedy as well between Johnny and Gyro. Now I think about it, that I forgot to include. But one of them is that it's established that Johnny has a bug bite fetish. Um, which was really weird. I have to assume that Araki has one, because how else do you even come up with that as a concept? Um, but yeah, that's really wild. And the real ending here is that Johnny takes Gyro's corpse back to Italy, though we don't see it in Italy. We see him get on the ship with it. And he also meets uh, Higashikata's daughter, who I believe he's going to marry, and that's how Part 8 will be established. And yeah, that's it. That is part 7. It's my favorite part. It's nearly a 9 out of 10. I think I have a conclusion that I'll just give it an 8 though. I'm very excited for part 8. I would love to know what they do with it. I'm assuming it's basically part 2 again, but very different. Maybe there'll be another Joseph. Maybe there'll be something completely different. Who knows? A lot of important characters didn't show up in this part, and we've already had the Caesar character and the Stroheim character and stuff, so who even knows what's going to happen now? It could really diversify. But of course, we do know that if assuming this is the same universe that Part 6 ended in, Jolene still exists, so there must be something that goes on. Either way, this was an absolute masterpiece. It didn't live up to my expectation because I was basically expecting a 10 out of 10, something that really defied and subverted all of my expectations going into any part of JJBA, and it wasn't really able to do that. But it is one of the best written stories I've read in a minute, and it's definitely the best part of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Yeah, I'm a really big fan of this, and there isn't much else to say, to be honest. So yeah, part 8 should come out relatively quickly. I don't have that much to do right now. And after that, I'm not going to be doing part 9 until it's finished, is the decision I've made. But what I will do is I might make some sort of video covering all 8 parts as a whole, and then we'll move on to making videos on something else. I have no idea what yet, but we will. And that's all there is to say, really. So yeah, I mean, thanks for watching. Yeah, bye.